Welcome to the REPO4EU Podcast, Season 2. I'm your host, Alexandra Rodriguez, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Frank Ruwe, a senior consultant for clinical operations management at 3D-PharmXchange. As a partner and work package leader in the REPO4EU project, Frank is bringing his expertise in designing and implementing innovative clinical trials to build a dedicated area within the REPO4EU platform. His final goal is to help researchers and anyone involved in drug repurposing design effective clinical trials to make sure repurposed medicines reach the patient. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, Frank. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the second season of the REPO4EU podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me in this podcast. My first time in a podcast, so I'm very curious what happens.
Well, I'm honored to hear that. And I guess we can start with an easy question for you, Frank, just to break the ice a little bit. So it would be good for our listeners to know more about your background, your career, and your current involvement in the EU-funded project REPO4EU. So tell us about your journey so far.
I'm a biomedical scientist, and during my studies I focused a lot on the brain, psychiatry, neurology. That had my full interest. So after my studies I looked for a company that developed drugs in that area, and we had one in the Netherlands that was called Organon, and there I did a lot of clinical development, clinical studies, writing protocols, leading the clinical development teams for antidepressant development or antipsychotic or sleep drugs, and it went more and more towards project management, and that made me move into clinical operations. And after that big pharma journey, I joined Thermo Fisher and Phillips, where I was also program manager for clinical development programs. After those big companies, it was time for me to look to smaller companies with shorter lines, less hierarchic. So I came to 3D-PharmXchange. It's a consultancy company where a lot of specialists are in the house on preclinical area, regulatory, translational, clinical pharmacology, and also clinical. And I'm leading there the clinical operations group. And 3D-PharmXchange were founded by REPO4EU because of the experience with design of clinical trials. So Harald Schmid, our project coordinator, asked 3D to become partner in the REPO4EU project. And there I am the work package 8 leader, all about clinical trials.
Some of our listeners might be quite familiar with the role of clinical trials in general, but in our case, we're interested mostly in how they are involved along the drug repurposing journey. So drawing from your experiences so far, could you contextualize for us which role in particular the early stage clinical trials play in giving a new life to existing medicines when we're trying to bring them into the market and make them accessible to patients?
Well, drug development is of course a very long and laborsome track, and it normally ends with the collection of clinical evidence for efficacy and safety claims that the product owner wants to write down in the package insert of his new product. And that clinical evidence needs to come from clinical studies, from clinical trials. Phase 1 studies, that's the early phase where you search for safety and you do dose finding. In phase 2, there's the proof of concept studies. And in phase 3, you have a fully powered confirmation of the efficacy and safety claims. You do all these studies, by means of well-designed protocol, a research protocol, and these trials have to take care for the conclusions on the targeted endpoints. In developing repurposed drugs, it may be that you don't need that many studies because there's a lot of data already known from the drug that is on the market. So maybe you can skip your phase 1 program, which is about safety. But on the other hand, if you're targeting a new population or a new indication with an old drug or with a new formulation or a different dosage, that could also require another phase 1 trial program because you have new kind of patients. So you cannot always skip parts of that clinical program when you are developing a repurposed drug. In any way, development of a drug, whether it's repurposed or not, is a very expensive process. So it's very important to keep the development costs as low as possible and at the same time reduce the risk of failure. And that means that your trials need to be designed very carefully, and trials are very important because of the costs and because of the chance for failure. Yeah, it needs all attention. So that is, I think, the role that I play here in the REPO4EU project, to pay attention to how the clinical trials should be done.
Let's expand a little bit more on this, actually, because as we all know, drug development is quite a lengthy process and it involves quite high costs as well. And we know specifically that bringing a repurposed drug to the market will cut some of those corners, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So in your view, Frank, what are the biggest challenges that, let's say, investigators are facing today when working specifically within the drug repurposing development journey?
So before taking the huge investment for a clinical program, for a clinical trial, an investigator or researcher wants to be sure whether the investment can be earned back. And if the drug is already on the market and off patent, everybody is free to use it. So off-label use is around the corner. Very cheap, no investment needed. So before you start the development of a repurposed drug, you have to think at least twice. And also, pending patent can be obstructive in researching the drug in a new indication, because the market authorization holder can block the purchase of a market formulation for other purposes. So the challenges and the higher chances for a lower return on investment when you develop a repurposed drug make it essential to lower the failure risk of the clinical program and to be cost efficient and to have fast development timelines. So how you do that? Our idea is to do that with smart clinical trial strategies and selective patient populations. Repurposed drugs typically enter development without commercial resources and timelines or risk tolerance of programs that are led by the industry. And it makes efficiency not only desirable but even essential. And so trial designs must maximize the learning per patient, the learning per euro. So we think that innovative approaches may allow investigators to test hypotheses quickly, to refine dose and population selection in real time, and to discontinue when it doesn't work, discontinue early. And these strategies reduce the exposure to non-effective treatments, while at the same time they preserve the patient burden and the patient goodwill and limited academic funding. What is also important, that is the selection of patient populations that might benefit more or better based on the drug's mechanism of action. So when a drug is repurposed for a novel indication, then a broad recruitment of patients, a heterogeneous enrollment, can dilute the true signals of efficacy, especially when the indication is defined by molecular features rather than symptoms. So if you include patients in your trial, for example, with specific biomarkers or genetic variants or disease subtypes, then you increase the probability of detecting a meaningful biological and clinical effect. The result, in our view, lower failure risks, lower costs, and a faster development track. So that's, I think, how to mitigate the challenges of developing a repurposed drug.
Let's focus now on the REPO4EU platform. So Frank, in your case, as we all know by now, you are an expert in clinical trials. But I'm curious to know a bit more about what in particular are you working on within the REPO4EU platform development, and how this platform can help to solve some of these hurdles that we were discussing earlier for clinical trials in drug repurposing.
The platform, I see it as a unique online tool designed to provide academic institutions or startups with know-how that help them developing their repurposed drug. And the parts that I'm responsible for are the topics related to clinical trials, to bring up all kinds of information, resources and tools, and to present that in a modern, bite-sized manner. Clear and concise in text or in graphics or as a decision tree. Now, the challenge is to bring it in an attractive way to the reader, to the user of the platform.
So let's say in practice, if someone logs onto the platform today looking to learn more about clinical trials, what will they find in there? Could you walk us through some of the key tools and services that are available within the REPO4EU platform, but specifically in the clinical trials section?
We have divided or distributed our content regarding clinical trials into different themes. We call them tools, services, and information. And as examples of services, we provide a matchmaking database of sites who are experienced in doing early phase trials, phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials. So you can look for a suitable site to use for your trial. There are also, as a service, links to the latest regulations and legislations websites for EMA, FDA, EU. There's plenty of rules, laws, and regulations in this world of clinical research. So you need to have the latest ones available. That is also provided as a service here. And as examples of tools, we have, for example, created a trial design tool that is a sort of decision tree that includes a couple of questions and that guides the researcher or the investigator towards suggestions for an appropriate trial design. And we're very proud that first steps that we made here in that decision tree, in that trial design tool, were successful. We saw some examples in the REPO last year. Well, there's also a protocol template fulfilling all the regulatory requirements and obligations. We show an essentials checklist, budgeting tool, template for roles and responsibility when you execute a clinical trial. And then for every task, it should be clear which party is responsible or accountable for that task. And there's, of course, also a section on scientific advice. How can you approach the regulatory bodies for a discussion on your ideas, on your strategy? So that's also important. So these were a couple of examples of services and tools that we have provided on the platform.
And I think it would be good also to mention the availability of REPO4EU's own case studies. So how can external parties actually benefit from these examples to guide their own repurposing projects?
Well, these case studies are presented to read about the real-life research projects with repurposed drugs, of course. So you can see there how did other researchers do their trials, what special elements did they include in their trials, what endpoints did they use, what results did they have. So it's just to make them familiar with how you approach these research challenges, how you do these trials. There's 3 pilot trials included in the REPO project. These are starting up. So these pilot trials are sort of validation of the whole concept idea of REPO4EU.
It definitely sounds like a very comprehensive list of tools and services, like you were saying, Frank, for researchers, for anyone interested in clinical trials, for drug repurposing. But there's another very interesting feature there, which is a clinical trial handbook. How revolutionary, let's say, is this specific resource for the drug repurposing community? And what's the work involved behind the scenes to make a resource like this come to life?
Well, the clinical trial handbook, that's a very comprehensive piece of work. It consists of complete descriptions of all aspects associated with clinical trials. So it starts with designing the trial, creation of a study protocol, preparation of a study, the startup, execution, completion of a trial. All those parts have different essentials, obligations, and a lot of tasks are included there. And it's all described in that compendium. And because in a clinical trial, the safety of patients and the integrity of data are the highest priority, the compendium also has a lot of attention for the regulations and the legislation associated with clinical research. So in summary, it is a very complete handbook. When you don't know anything about clinical trials and you read this handbook, then you know a lot.
Now, looking into the future of the platform, what comes next? What is on your wish list for future platform releases, specifically regarding the clinical trials module?
Yeah, we are still developing content for the platform, of course, and we saw in the alpha release that was presented at Rexpo 25 in Barcelona, the first steps regarding, for example, the trial design strategy tool we developed will be to optimize that tool and make it usable for as many as possible. But another big task is to pay more attention, full attention on how the material is presented on the platform. As I previously said, it's a lot of text divided over different themes and sections, but we think these need to be presented in a very attractive way. So that is the challenge that we have in front of us. But of course, that's a nice task. The content is there, and now we have to decorate it.
Well, Frank, as we wrap up, and this is my last question for you today, I think for those listening who might be interested in exploring the Repo4EU platform, what would you say is the functionality, the tool, or the service within the clinical trials module that you're most proud of having contributed to?
Well, if I have to mention one, and then it's of course the compendium, because it was so much work created with the help of many. It was a very nice collaboration of people within 3D-PharmXchange and also with partners in the Repo4EU project, but especially my colleagues from 3D-PharmXchange. They're all specialists in their area. Is it translational medicine or preclinical or regulatory or clinical pharmacology? They've all helped a lot with that, and the result is very good. So if I have to mention one thing that I'm proud of, then it's this compendium.
Well, Frank, it's been a pleasure having you with us today, and just wanted to say best of luck with all your pending tasks for the Repo4EU platform.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk with you and to, tell about my contribution to the Repo4EU platform.
For more information about Repo4EU and the mission behind the project, please visit repo4.eu and make sure to follow the project on all the social media. We're on X, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and YouTube. If you simply type Repo4EU, you'll find us there. Until the next one.